how can you drive digital innovation in a down economy? And I think there's sort of a big debate going on is there actually a recession? Is there not a recession? Are things slowing down? Are they not slowing down? But whether that turns out to be the case or not, I think it's on everybody's mind. And so we got to thinking about, what are we hearing from a lot of our customers, a lot of the people that we talk to when it comes to innovating in sort of a tough economic sort of environment. And so we put together some thoughts today that we hope you guys will take some value out of. And so we'll go ahead and kind of dive in. As usual, I like to make this interactive. So it doesn't have to be a one-way presentation. If you have comments or thoughts or questions along the way, throw those in the chat window or the question window, and we can address those along the way. And even if you have things that are going on that you're wanting some input on or to kind of add to the conversation, we want to hear that too. So don't worry about interrupting. Go ahead and throw that in there, and would love to kind of field a lot of those questions along the way. And then of course, we'll have a Q&A at the very end where we can kind of take some questions. We had a few of them that had gotten sent in prior to, so we'll go over those as well as anything that you guys have. Before we kind of dive into the topic, just for those of you that don't know me, my name's Jeff Francis. I'm one of the founders of ENO8. We're a digital innovation studio based here in Dallas, Texas. I've personally worked on launching over a couple of hundred different digital products over the years. And so seen a lot and just love doing these webinar workshop sessions with you guys to kind of share some of those experiences and really just talk about a lot of the questions and conversations that we hear come up often enough that we think other people might be able to benefit from it. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. So this first one, you guys might accuse me of being a little bit obvious, but the first one that we want to talk about is don't lose focus on the customer, or I put /user, right? Oftentimes the user is the same as the customer, sometimes not, but don't lose focus of the customer. I think a mistake that's pretty common is, especially when you're thinking about innovation, is it's easy to get caught up in what can be done versus deciding on whether it should be done, right? Or if you're going to do something or pursue an initiative, what does success look like, right? And so I think, rule number one here is, before we talk about any of this other stuff, is don't lose sight of the customer. Stay focused on what's going on with the customer. What challenges are they facing now? And you can even tie that into sort of the theme that we've got in this workshop as well of sort of looking at innovation in a down economy. Thinking about, like, is that on the mind of your customers? What changes are they looking for? What things that potentially would provide value to them if that environment is something that's on someone else's mind? A great example is just this workshop topic, right? We know that a lot of our customers, they're feeling that pressure of needing to innovate, needing to be competitive. And at the same time, they may be facing revenue or cost pressures or pressures from stakeholders, investors, executives, that kind of thing, right? So take that same sort of frame of mind and look at it from your customer's perspective and figure out what might be going on with them to help reveal where you might focus a lot of your innovation efforts. The next one is invest like your bootstrap startup. This one may sound kind of funny for those of you that work for larger organizations, but we work with quite a mix of clients. Some of those are more like enterprise type of organizations. Others are startups that are well-funded, like VC-backed type of companies. Others are bootstrapped by the founders, and maybe they're funding it on their own or with the assistance of friends and family, that kind of thing early on, or they're already growing and they're sort of self-funding through growth, right? But what I mean when a couple things when I talk about think like a bootstrap startup is an example is act as if it's your own money, right? So when you make these investment decisions, really thinking of it as if it's your own money, and if I'm the one writing this check, is this how I would approach it? or would I even approach it? So it's a great way to sort of think through, is this something that would be valuable to pursue? Is this something that has a reasonably high chance of success? And I'll talk in a minute about what are the different ways that you could sort of step into that, like a startup would be forced how to do. That kind of brings me to the comment on the slide here about narrow your evaluation window. And sort of what I mean by that is, I think that many times in a really large organization, they'll do these very large sort of engagements, these very large scale efforts just to assess something, like judging viability, testing, that kind of thing. So, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes with the really big consulting companies, to do these big formalized, large scale innovation engagements. And what I would like to challenge is that maybe in a tighter economic environment, it makes more sense to be a little bit more lean and a little bit more narrow about how do you pursue those types of things, right? So what are ways that you can sort of chop that up into smaller pieces to evaluate, look at feasibility, test, get feedback, and, identify what those parameters for sort of continuing down a journey that is maybe cut up into smaller bites, right? I call them validation gates. And so, and I'll talk about that, like going into this third point, right? So this one is, make sure that you're picking your shots carefully, right? So you may not be able to spread as many different initiatives out. You may not be able to take as many on for budget reasons or just resource constraints. So, some of the things that to think about when you're trying to pick your shots more carefully is, maybe increasing the frequency of, like, what I just mentioned is validation gates. And so what is a validation gate? I talk a lot about this in some of our other workshops. But what I mean by that is basically being clear on, you may have a really big objective, right? But what are the crucial steps of validation that you need to go through successfully in order to get to sort of this more grand vision? And so a validation gate would typically have a very clear sort of objective. It would have a very clear way of measuring, or it could potentially have some sort of a hypothesis that you're looking to prove, right? And so I call them gates because each time you get to that step, you need to be able to look at that data, look at the results, and in order to pass through that gate, you sort of need to reconfirm that, yes, we've seen what we need to, so we're going to take the next step, right? And so, think of it too as like, I think it's always good to have these validation gates, but particularly when you're a little more resource constrained and having to be more careful, you may want to shrink them down. So, for instance, if those chunks or those stretches of effort are 3-4 months long, what are ways that maybe you can shrink that down? Can you do that in like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks? Shrink those down, do them in smaller bites so that you're able to sort of get that validation. And that builds confidence, right? And I frequently say too that, confidence is sort of the antidote to risk. And so the more that you can be very intentional about these validation gates, hitting those targets, and then deciding on the other side of that to move forward, builds confidence among everybody that is involved. And you'll also see some pretty good results when it comes to shrinking down the timeframes to sort of hit objectives, as well as what's the investment needed at each of those stages, right? So think of it as just making, smaller bite-sized chunks, right? One other comment on that is just being very clear about the assumptions, right? That's a big part of sort of deciding on what these are. The scientific method, shows up a lot in innovation, right? And so when you make a hypothesis or you have a theory that something can make a difference, being clear on like, well, what are the assumptions that we're making and how can our validation gates help sort of prove that out, right? So, things like finding better ways to experiment, to test, to collect that data. And then, another thing here is just being very intentional about prioritization. So as I mentioned, a lot of people are starting to feel a little bit of that pressure of having to tighten up on resources and be more narrowly focused. So being really clear on the prioritization. And so where does this fall into the overall priority of the different things that you could potentially pursue, right? And then along with that is also making sure that this has a very clear tie to your broader organizational goals. So if you can tell that story and you can understand, why is this initiative worth pursuing, and you can tie that to larger organizational goals, then it helps you make sure that you're picking the right priorities. And as I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, it also helps make sure that you get everybody on board that needs to be involved with that, right? So bottom line, smaller, more incremental steps with clear validation gates at each step that still align to your more broad organizational goals. Next is have a clear process or framework, right? I think a lot of times we talk about innovation, it seems like this sort of broad conceptual kind of thing that pretty much anybody will tell you that they want to attain, right? And so I haven't encountered too many people that just say, I don't want to be innovative, right? Everyone talks about that, but I think it's very important to have some sort of a process or framework or method that you use to sort of apply to these different innovation initiatives as they come up and you decide that you want to sort of pursue those, right? A couple things there. One is the more clear and well-defined your process is, the easier it's going to be to help stay on time, stay on budget, stay on track with what you're doing, right? In the long run, you'll be able to move much faster also, right? I mean, we do a lot of these for our clients, and the more over time that we refine our process, even things like checklist, being clear on roles and responsibilities, learning from every one of these that we do and incorporating those learnings into the next time that we do it, that process just runs more efficient. So we can actually achieve a whole lot more each time than we were before with less resources. And so think of it almost like an innovation machine that you can sort of fine tune and modify to improve over time. But you can't do that if you don't sort of standardize to some typical approach to vetting these. And I think I'll share a story about a client that we worked with that we do innovation labs for on a pretty frequent basis. And one of the things they share with us is that they get a lot of these different ideas or potential initiatives from various stakeholders, board members, executives, team members, kind of throughout the organization. And one of the things they like about our process is that they have a way to sort of channel it. They can take the idea in, take the input in, they can sort of vet it, prioritize it. And then the ones that sort of clear that screen, they can go a little bit deeper on it to gather the necessary information, maybe even test. And then they can go back to those people with that additional information and clarity before they take next steps, right? But we can't do that without that process. An example of this is that, design thinking can be a great friend in this type of thing. I'm not saying that your innovation process has to be design thinking or even heavily based on design thinking. It's just from our personal experience, it's a really great way to expand your thinking about a potential opportunity or a problem that you're trying to solve, to back up, make sure you're looking at the right problem and you're trying to solve the right issue. And then again, sort of expanding to explore what are potential solutions to this, right? And that's just one, element of the design thinking process. Another one that's really good is it's very focused on very quickly pulling a team together, experimenting, exploring, prototyping, validating, and then making a decision, right? And so again, it's just an example of one way to do it. There's lots of good ones out there, but keep that in mind. That could be an option. If you guys don't already have a process, that could be a pretty good place to start looking, right? And I talked a little bit about the last one there, like documentation is king. What I mean by that is that whatever that process is, make sure you got something documented. And this doesn't need to be a huge, fluffy document, right? I think some of the things that we found work best for us is simple checklist, right? Knowing that every time we do this, here's the checklist. And even if some of those steps don't really apply in a particular situation, at least you're deliberately choosing to not do that step and you know why, right? So having some sort of a checklist, having some sort of process, having some sort of documentation around what are the necessary resources or team members or talents that typically need to be involved with that process is a great place to start with having documentation. Okay. Next is something that I think we're seeing more and more of, but consider flexible staffing or personnel options. Maybe we can give a lot of credit to COVID for accelerating a lot of the things that we're seeing and how talent is utilized in the workforce now. But a lot of companies that may not have done it in the past even offered things like fractional resources or almost on-demand type of resources. And so being willing to explore those kinds of options where you don't necessarily have to have all of the necessary talent on your in-house team, you can look at other options that might be a little bit more flexible. And this kind of ties back to thinking like a bootstrap startup. A lot of times they pursue different ways of getting access to the talent that they need that a lot of folks in the enterprise space may overlook. And so, a couple more things on that, like having a repeatable innovation process or an approach towards sort of the overall innovation pursuit. It does require some pretty specialized and experienced, more niche talent. And so I'll give you an example that we run across. A design thinking strategist or a facilitator can be really valuable in some of these processes. I know it is for us, but for most organizations, it may not make sense to have that type of a person, especially the one with the experience and capabilities that really make a difference. It may not make sense for them to have that type of resource on their full-time staff, right? It's really hard to keep that type of person busy on that type of work all the time. And so if you do have them and they're not fully utilized in what really they're uniquely good at, it makes it really hard to retain them as well. And these are not inexpensive resources. And so that sort of feeds this need to have options where you have flexibility and you can utilize those really talented resources sort of in a way that meets your organization needs where you are right then. So another option is you can consider looking at vendors or partners that are more plug and play. Obviously, it's a shameless plug for us. This is what we do a lot of, but some of the things that I think are pretty attractive about that option is that you sort of get the whole package and it's plug and play, right? You get the specialized resources, talent, you also get the process, you also get the accountability. And so a lot of times in organizations that have lots of different priorities going on, their in-house staff already has a lot of things that are already on their radar. And so there will be these initiatives or these projects or these things that the team wants to pursue, but they just constantly float to the back burner. And so by using a third-party partner or vendor, a lot of times you can fast track those, get those done, and either decide to move forward with them or move them out, right? And so that's a good way to look at it. And it's sort of there when you need it, and then it's off when you don't need it. So that could be another flexible option that might be worth looking at. The last one here, I sort of laughed as I was putting this together because this item here shows up in a lot of these workshops that we put together, and it really is important. And I don't think a lot of people talk about it, but this importance of aligning stakeholders. If I think through so many different product efforts that I've been involved with over the years, so much of the challenges can be traced back to people not being on the same page. And that could be something as broad as the general vision for what we're trying to do. It could be a lack of consensus on what is success. Maybe they haven't even had that conversation, like what does success look like? So this one's important here. So when you're trying to drive innovation in a down economy, because even more important, because if you don't have people aligned to the prioritization of what you pursue, what do you need to see at those validation gates? How much money are you willing to invest? What resources will you need? Where does this fit in the overall priority scheme? Things start to get really tough, right? So especially when budgets shrink, right? So a lot of people are feeling the pressure of shrinking budgets, shrinking headcount, having to do more with less, right? A great way to enroll people in things that you really have a strong belief that should be pursued is getting them on the same page, right? So building that consensus, aligning stakeholders is even more important in this type of environment. So on that, I'll move to Q&A. I haven't seen questions come through yet. So Jordan, I know that you're on. There was a handful of questions that you had already received. I can talk through some of those while we're waiting. But if any of you others have other questions or even just comments or thoughts on this too that you want to throw in, then go ahead and put those in the chat window while I'm answering these, and we'll come back to those. Okay, so the first one I have here is, what would you consider to be a bite-sized innovation process? You know, admittedly, this is a pretty relative judgment on this kind of thing. It's very heavily dependent on how big the organization is, how big of the overall effort it is, that kind of thing. But in my mind, I like to see things where between, you know, is as short as a week up to 4 or 5 weeks. That's a really good window where at least you can go at one of these initiatives and have some clear objectives and get what you need to see before you decide to go next. So this doesn't mean that the overall innovation effort is, you know, 1 to 5 weeks or anything like that. It just means shrink it down and chop it into pieces. So I think if you can get it down to a week, a couple of weeks, or, you know, 4 to 5 weeks, that's a pretty good range to think about in terms of chopping this stuff up into more bite-sized pieces. Next I had, what does a successful innovation process look like at a high level? You know, I touched on it a little bit, but I think the important thing here that I would stress is don't overthink having to have a really complex process. I think like just having a high level process documented is a massive win. It's something to start with. So a couple of things I would think about having as a part of that is, are there some particular types of artifacts or data that are going to be really important to you to make sure that you have every time? What would be the different roles and resources needed for doing these, right? So an example of that could be like, what would the different team members be? Do we need somebody from customer service? Do we need somebody from product? Do we need somebody from IT? Do we need a designer? Do we need a strategist? Do we need a solutions architect? Think about like, what are the different roles that you might need, and be clear on, you know, where do I get those? Do I have them on my in-house team, or do I have to find someone to help fill those gaps? The checklist that I talked about a little bit more, or a little bit earlier, that's a really good part of documentation, right? Maybe even some sort of a sample time frame for how you approach them, and what time is needed from the different resources that would be involved. That could be something good, because I know something we track a lot is, okay, for our process, how much time is needed from the different roles? And then we constantly look at that after we finish to determine, was that correct? Were we able to go as deep as we needed to? Did we get enough time for that person? Did we have too much in a role that we didn't really need? And then, you know, I think another thought on this would be, if you can sort of try to standardize the set of deliverables that come out of these efforts, right? A couple of things will happen if you're able to do that. One is you get faster. As you start to standardize what the output of these are, it gets a lot quicker to put them together, right? So I know that for us, the first time that we put together like a summary presentation or the summary deck that kind of gives the high level of everything, it took us a lot longer than it does these days because we've done so many of those that we can start to templatize and make it a lot more efficient to create those deliverables. So for your organization, if you think about what is the typical set of assets or artifacts that you would create in these efforts and try to standardize those deliverable sets, I think that's a good piece of what I'd sort of lump into the bucket of like documentation, right? So the process could include roles and responsibilities. What's the general timeline? How do we define objectives? Using a checklist. Here's the checklist of how we run the process. That's a pretty good place to start. I had another one here. This question says, does this approach still allow you to go after the quote moonshot innovations? Yes. I was thinking about this a lot, like as we were putting this together of, how might this land with folks that are thinking really big, right? So nothing about what I'm talking about here is designed to shrink down sort of the vision of what's possible, or to exclude those sort of more like moonshot, really large, very disruptive, very innovative types of efforts, right? All that I'm talking about is take that big moonshot and figure out how can you break that into smaller pieces where you're sort of progressively validating at each step, and it's a little bit more manageable, right? So, in the case of something that may be one of those sort of like crazy ideas or those really disruptive ideas, it's okay to have that vision. In fact, that I think creates a lot of excitement. But if you can take that big vision, you can trace it back to these smaller steps that sort of help push us towards deciding whether we're going to continue to go towards that. That's a great way to approach it. That's a really good question. We're doing that. Just a quick note. If you guys like these or you don't like them even, drop us a note. We love getting feedback so we can kind of prove these in the future. A great way to reach us is just to send an email to info@eno8.com. That's ENO and the number 8.com. Also, I'm really active on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to me there, direct message me and connect. So yeah, if you have a thought on this ENO8 Answers, or if you have ideas or there's a topic that you'd be really interested in us tackling in the future, be sure to share that with us as well. And then if you have any additional interest, we create a few different things. We have a weekly email that goes out that we pick a topic. A lot of times they'll sort of relate to the ENO8 Answers that we're doing at the time, but we promise not to blow up your email. Usually those are about once a week. And then we also have a mailing list where we can let you know of future ENO8 workshops that we'll do in those topics, so you can join us for those if it's something that you think might be helpful. As always, we love feedback on topics that you guys are really interested in. So please share those. And then for more information on our innovation lab, I talked a little bit about that kind of throughout the workshop today. If you have an interest or want to look at some more information on kind of how we do it, take a look at our website there. It's eno8.com/innovation-lab. And with that, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate it. And hope to see you next time.